All right, I have two images for you. First, we have a skeleton, and then we have a jellyfish. And let's say we're on a seashore in a thunderstorm. So we start by throwing the skeleton into the sea. Now, it will fall apart, but the bones are still strong. Now, what do we do if we throw in the jellyfish? Well, it will stay alive, it will stay intact. However, after a storm, when you walk along the beach, you will often find little jellyfish corpses because the jellyfish had no strength to be able to resist the storm, and they go ashore and they die on shore. Unlike the skeleton, they won't leave anything behind. I would propose that this illustration is the world in which we find ourselves now, and the jellyfish and the skeleton represent the extreme sides in which we can land philosophically. A skeleton has no life or power. A skeleton philosopher uses out of date terms which her hearers cannot understand. She presents problems, solutions, and illustrations which her audience don't relate to. So she's at best ignored. At worst, she actually hinders people from following Jesus. On the other hand, a jellyfish theologian or philosopher is relevant. She may be quite popular, but she's floating along with the ever changing current. She says the same words, maybe with a veneer of poorly applied remaining Christianity that her culture is saying. She has no backbone and no heart, and that is rooted in the truth which Jesus presents. Therefore, the jellyfish teaching will die on the shore. It will not stand in the face of God's eternal truth. The goal of the next 20 or so minutes and the work which we are going to do over the next month is I want us to be neither floating jellyfish nor dead skeletons. I want us to be competent swimmers in a stormy sea. I want us to understand our culture and learn how to interact with it so that we can engage with each other and specifically our teenagers, younger people, the Gen Z, as they say, and understand their world, their questions, and their shortcomings, and present God's truth to life in a way which sets them and sets us free. In this talk up ahead, I'm going to present the influences of modern philosophy and technology on our culture. And we're going to talk about how this culture is impacting us in the areas of pornography, sexuality, and gender confusion. Okay, and once again, as I have mentioned before, wherever I am using terms that you don't know what they mean, don't be afraid to consult your definitions, which I have linked to. Okay, first, we're going to talk some philosophy. I made you a cheat sheet with pictures to help you hang with me. This is a very cursory overview of some really thick material. I encourage you to take the time and read on your own to understand this. The book that's really impacted me is Benjamin Wicker's 10 Books That Screwed Up the World. What I learned from reading that book was that just because I haven't sat down and specifically listened to a certain teacher or read a certain book, my thoughts can still be very, very shaped by this person, even if I didn't sit down under their teaching and say, I am ready to listen. There are some ideas that can greatly impact us, even if we don't know their sources. And so I'd like to talk to you about those sources. You don't have to read someone's stuff to have your mental landscape shaped by them. All right, so let's get into this chart. Now, the interesting thing about much of our thinking and our value system is that it's actually based in a Western culture. It's mostly based on the outworkings of Christian philosophy. Okay, so many of our ideas and values, like it's better to defend the weak than to exert power. It is better to listen to the individual than to just think about the collective. Even the term religion, many of these things started off with Jesus and the massive philosophical impact that his teaching had on the Western world, religious thinking, and the cultures that arose in conflict with and even working with these ideas. And the next phase you could call the psychological self. Now, this means this first implication or building on of the Christian premise is that the identity is something individual and inward focused. And so you have ideas in this phase, like even the idea, even the concept of I. You have I think, therefore I am. Um, you have the idea of an orderly and knowable universe. Now, part of what a big change that takes place in this first phase is there's two different kinds of worldviews. So, one set of worldview is that the world has order and meaning. We're not in a chaotic universe, but the world has order and meaning. Humans may discover it and they may conform to it. Well, with the Enlightenment, there was a big shift in how we perceive truth to where all of a sudden people started thinking from a position where the individual creates truth, meaning, and purpose. Again, that's the idea of I think, therefore I am. So the next phase after this is we go to the romantic self. This is where identity has to do with feelings, sensations, personal experiences, desires, and expression. A lot of this was spread and popularized with some of the poets and artists of the time, Wordsworth, Blake, Shelley. It's the idea that beauty is truth and morality is more of a preference and a feeling than a thing which we must discover and apply to our lives. And something to keep your eye out for all of these different ideas is that there's a concept called a death work, which is where art takes some of these dense ideas of the philosophers and makes it very mainstream. Okay, so a death work is a essentially it's bad art with a well, it can be. I mean, I don't know. I think we can call it bad art. I think we can say this. It's difficult because some of these things, like it may be a very, very catchy country song, but what makes something a death work is if they are subverting the very thing that they are trying to talk about. Okay, so let's take a country song, and this country song is purporting to talk about true love. Well, if this country song is talking about true love, but it's in the setting of a man having thoughts of longing about another man's wife, well, that's a problem because that kind of thinking actually undermines love entirely. So some of these ideas like, love is what it means to me, or you only live once. A lot of these ideas are in our art forms and they influence us. So once again, a death work is bad philosophy that is then spread to us, spread to people as we consume art. We are also consuming ideas. So we have the psychological self, where we're beginning to think in terms of I and the individual and perception. Then we go to the romantic self. Identity has to do with feelings. The next phase of thinking and philosophy was with the Industrial Revolution. We go to the plastic self, which purports that human nature is malleable. Okay, human nature can change, it's ever evolving. With that keyword evolve, we have thinkers like Darwin saying we come from evolution, there's survival of the fittest. Eugenics, we should kill people who are lesser than. Humanity, it can be thought of as animals who are just trying to fulfill our needs and drives. So with the Industrial Revolution comes these thinkers who more are looking at structures and seeing human nature as responsive, malleable, ever-changing. Next, we have the sexual self. This is starting to happen right around, think more modern towards the 1960s. We have thinkers like Freud, like Margaret Mead, like Kinsey. These people are thinking of happiness and personal identity is equated with sex and sexuality. So it's looking at sex. Once again, this is built on, all of these things are built on each other and the progression of ideas. So this is built on some of the plastic self ideas of evolution. Well, now the sexual instinct isn't something to be submitted, it's something to just be expressed. And uh, that's where we start hearing ideas like repression, and that there can be trauma from repressed sexual urges, and that the fully realized human is somebody who is expressing their sexuality and acting out of their sexuality. Now, the final phase of thinking um, is happening now. We can call it the sexually politicized self, because identity is about the inner self, especially one's sexual desires. Oppression becomes about conflicting values and emotions. So this means somebody says, I feel like, or I need to have sex with whoever I choose to have sex with. Well, when you say, I don't think that's a good idea, that's not just a matter of debating ideas or asking how do we live the best life. That becomes where words like toxic or oppressive can come into play. It's no longer a matter of what is the good life? How do we live the good life? How do we submit ourselves to any kind of standard of truth, order, justice, righteousness? Instead, all of those frameworks of moving in the world become oppressive and crushing and toxic. The moment that you step over somebody else's life and say, you may want to do that, not do that with your actions. You may not want to do that with your body. Um, these things are very sexuality and how we operate as sexual beings is very, very foundational to identity in a culture that so highly values the sexually politicized self. Now, add to all of this the digital revolution and technology. In 2012, the proportion of Americans who owned smartphones went over 50%. Um, we have the advent of social media, the internet, globalization, and we begin to enter into a time called liquid modernity, where things begin changing, and they begin changing really quickly. So this gets us to the final phase of our chart, which is called modern expressive individualism. This is marked by the value of freedom for individuals. We celebrate self expression. We find ourselves by looking inward. Happiness is our life purpose, and morality is just a personal preference. And we reject external authority. So, the whole point of everything I just talked at you for and this chart, I want you to walk away from this not going blah, 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 bunch of dead guys and gals. I want you to walk away from this having a little bit of an understanding that the ideas that you're hearing and even many of the gut instinct feelings that you have learned how to walk with in this world, many of these things are standing on this idea leads to this idea, leads to this idea, and then we combine it and we get to the place that we're at. So this chart is an encouragement for you to start evaluating the ideas that you hold and why you hold them. All right, so there is our philosophy chart. Now, I had mentioned the last phase of the chart talks about phones and technology. Now, did you know that our skulls are changing shape these days? People are growing bone spurs, which look like actual horns on the backs of their skulls because they spend so much time looking down that their bodies grow to kind of counterbalance the weight. So, if the physical changes are happening, these are only the beginning. Looking back at the chart that I gave you, we are undergoing a massive technological and social revolution. It may take centuries to understand the changes that are happening, but we can track some of it now. I have heard the changes that are happening right now as it's not like the printing press so much as the invention of language. So again, these changes are massive. It may take a long time to fully understand, but an article in The Atlantic postulates that normally social change happens like this. There's a slow curve. But, and so really with social change, it's either a slow curve or it's like, things aren't changing that much. People are people. However, after 2012, which remember is that point when over 50% of the population got a smartphone in their hands, I'm talking about America, um, the charts started getting all kinds of crazy. We see plummets, we see sharp increases, we see quick changes. So check this chart graphic, which is on the screen. Today's youth spend, on average, 9 hours a day in front of screens. That's 63 hours, almost 3 full days per week. As a result, a 16-year-old girl in Missouri youth ministry likely has more in common culturally with a boy of the same age in Manhattan than with a 60-year-old woman, 60-year-old woman in her own church. The digital world that students inhabit can be completely compartmentalized from their physical world. Youth leaders may have no reference to the cultural stories told to the youth through social media and video games. So it's easy for students to believe that these worlds between their church and between their church or their schools and their screen worlds may have nothing to do with one another. Um, so, what are the real world effects of this culmination of philosophy and phones? I propose that the following traits are the outstanding hurdles and even the defining traits of Gen Z and Gen Alpha, that is the middle school, high school, and young college students who we are discipling, or who older people are mentoring, teaching, working with. So, real world effect number one is pornography. Remember, I gave you a cheat sheet with some of the definitions from the dictionary online, and I'll use one of those words now. Pornography is the depiction, the showing of nakedness and erotic or sexual behavior. So that's like pictures, films, or writing that's intended to cause sexual excitement. Pornography is pictures of naked people or people having sexual intercourse. I defined it to be clear, but some of you might be rolling your eyes like, wah, 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 I've been hearing this my whole life, you say. Well, nothing new. But here's a quote which explains what I'm talking about. Quote, we're dealing with a generation of young people who, in many cases, were exposed to pornography as children. Adolescent minds have been formed or deformed by consistent access to pornography available on the phone. Most students have some sort of baggage that's related to pornography, or they're fighting the addictive impulse of this habitual sin, or they're dealing with the fallout from the mind warping aspects of viewing so much sexual distortion. Our society, and too often our churches, have failed to grapple with the long term ramifications of this kind of porn use. Pop stars like Billie Eilish say, quote of her, viewing porn as a child destroyed her brain, end quote from Billie. Time featured a cover story on men whose porn use has wrecked their relationships. Even many in the secular, that is, people who aren't in the church, even many in the secular world understand that we are dealing with a serious issue. The impact on future church leaders is significant. That's the end of my big quote. So, the statistics on this are frightening. I have 2 more quotes from you. Recent studies indicate that 90% of teens have viewed porn online and 10% admit to daily use. This is partly due to increased smartphone usage among children and adolescents, with elementary age smartphone ownership rising to over 50% in recent years. Let me emphasize the young ages at which this is happening. In a study of 300,000 internet users in the age category of 7 to 10 years old, every 4th kid was watching porn at least once a month. Among 14 through 15-year-olds, about 10% of boys surveyed watch pornography every day. And what this looks like has changed very quickly, too. For us older people, pornography may look like the blatant nudity that one may choose to watch in a show like Game of Thrones, or that one accesses on a website. With young people, however, their experience of pornography or the introduction to it is very likely to be in the sharing or soliciting, that is, asking for nude pictures of the children themselves. I learned a title for this. It's called Self Generated Child Sexual Abuse Material. It is illegal to show a child pornography or to look at these naked pictures, even when the child shares the pictures of their own naked body. Yet, quote, sharing of nudes was up across nearly all demographic variables related to gender, age, and sexual identity, with a study finding that 17% of all kids ages 9 to 17 say that they have shared nudes, a 6% increase from 2019. This increase was more pronounced among pre-teens, that's 9 to 12-year-olds, and boys. Now, let me repeat myself. This is illegal for children to share or receive naked pictures of themselves. And according to that study, almost 1 in 5 young people between 9 and 17 have taken and shared these pictures. I read a book about this all the way back in 2015, and I started informally polling the young people to see if this was hitting our circles. I live in Indiana. Again, it's Indiana, it's the Midwest, it's some pretty conservative circles. Now, in 2015, only my older girls, ages 16 and up, had seen, sent, or received naked pictures. However, a group of young people last year who were at summer camp, one of my leaders surveyed her middle school girls. Of the 8 girls in the room, the only little girl who had not seen or sent a naked picture was the one middle school girl without a phone. Most of the girls had these pictures sent to them without their consent by social media. I want to emphasize that this is not just a boy problem. The gap is closing rapidly between male and female pornography addiction as more children are being exposed to the material. Another thought that I have heard thrown around by all of this is it's the idea that the type of child who is looking at pornography is essentially a bad kid. Now, I hope that these statistics and this perspective can help to show you that it's not a question of whether or not this child is rebellious or whether or not this child is naughty or a little freaky. It's more a question of, does this young person have a phone, and does this person have access to the internet? It is not a question of if, it is a question of when. And what do we do when our young people are exposed to this material? This is part of their world in a way that it simply was not and maybe even is not for older generations. The next practical effect of our philosophy and our phones, and also of this widespread pornography use, which we've discussed, is a vast amount of confusion about gender and about sexual expression. So earlier I talked about the influence of philosophy, the combination and the building of lots of ideas like the authenticity and reliability of the inner self, the corruption of society and power structures, humanity as a sexual animal, and the value of individual experience and emotion rather than communal values. And all of this has led us to a cultural moment where a statement like, "I'm a man trapped in a woman's body," make perfect sense to the person who's listening. See, the important thing is the individual and that person's inner experience of the world and how they feel about the world. Moreover, our views of power and politics have formed so that disagreement with someone else's feelings about their gender, sexuality, or body is not just neutral. It's actually dangerous, it's toxic, it's oppressive. To disagree with someone about how they use their bodies or their sexual choices is seen as an assertion of power, and oppression. In short, anything goes, do what you feel, or else. Now, let's take a person with and let's give them a developing brain. Let's take a person with such a personal experience, subjectively based view of truth, and let's put them into a world where they actually see and experience warped sexual activity. Okay, heads up, for the purpose of showing you what our people, what the children that we love and our peers are being exposed to, I'm going to give you a specific example, which is a bit shocking. I am not doing this to get graphic. I just want to prepare you. Okay, heads up. Here's my direct quote. Choking and strangulation during sex is prevalent among young adults, with one study finding that 58% of women college students had ever been choked during sex. We found that women had first learned about choking through diverse sources, including pornography, erotic stories, magazines, social media, friends, and partners. Now, did you catch that? People are seeing and experiencing sexual violence, that's choking, from their own activity or from watching trends in pornography. Remember, 90% of teenagers have viewed porn online. So I'm using this as an example to talk about pornography's influence on gender and sexual confusion. Most choking is commonly perpetrated against women. Now, would that experience make sex look or feel appealing? Would it make you want to be the female in that situation if you were watching it? Would you want to be a female at all? Two statistics which show the prevalence of sexual confusion are as follows. Nearly 1 in 6 of Gen Z adults identify as bisexual, with 1 in 10 millennials and 1 in 5 Gen Z members identifying as LGBTQ. The proportion of LGBT Americans should exceed 10% in the near future. I've heard the proposal that this prevalence, this widespread nature of the transgender movement in particular, could be called a social contagion. These values are spreading very quickly and often among friend groups. So what? Let's bring this all together. Our young people are spending an average of 9 hours a day on screens. Much of their time is spent listening to each other on social media and the cultural messages of modern expressive individualism. Because of this, pornography exposure and gender confusion are widespread among our students. Again, so what? I hope to have helped you with my proposed step 1 with just this very talk itself. Step 1, parents, know your children. Be aware of what is going on in our culture. Listen to your kids. The older you are, the bigger the gap is between the ideas and images that your young people are exposed to and what your childhood looked like. Listen to the kids. Ask questions. Ask informed questions. Be aware that there could be vast differences between what's socially normative for you and what's normative for them. Learn what their world looks like. I need to emphasize something. Children and teens, I already mentioned this, I'm going to say it again. Children and teens who wrestle with pornography and gender confusion are not malicious. They are not slutty. Instead of, these kids have gone crazy, think more about the world and the structures that are surrounding them. Think about the voices that they're hearing and what they have been exposed to, and essentially who's talking to them. I heard an analogy about young people on the internet that said, what would it be like if we learned that everybody under age 18 in a city was sneaking out at night while the adults were sleeping and playing in the sewers unsupervised? That's a little bit of what it's like to have young people on the internet unsupervised. This leads us to my second point. Students, young people, we need you and we want you with us, no matter what your questions or struggles. You are not bad. You are not so damaged that you're beyond repair. You are not the scum who God cannot love. You are living in a new and a rapidly changing world, and a difficult one. We need you to tell us what it's like. Those of you students who are in Christ, we have the same faith. We have the same faith of the people who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they may rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all of these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what is promised, since God has provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. That is what we are a part of. We are a part of a legacy of people who have seen God as very powerful in cultures which are confusing, turbulent, exciting, strange. You are part of that. Those of you who have lots of questions, I and my fellow teachers, we believed in a man who endured the very worst betrayal at the hands of his best friends, and he stayed. Your questions aren't too much. You aren't too much. You will not scare away people who love you and people who love Jesus dearly. And so please, don't be afraid of scaring us away, no matter how dark your world is. Go to your church leaders. Go to your trusted adults. We are going to continue to discuss these issues, specifically gender and sexuality, in the weeks up ahead. So remember the illustration that I started with, the skeleton or the jellyfish at sea in a storm. I want to end with a picture of how I think, this is how C.S. Lewis thinks, that Jesus would enter into this metaphor of the skeleton and the jellyfish in a stormy sea. One may think of a diver, first reducing himself to nakedness, and then glancing in midair, and then gone with a splash, vanishing, rushing down through green and warm water into black and cold water, down through increasing pressure into the death-like region of ooze and slime and old decay, and then up again, back to color and light, his lungs almost bursting, until suddenly he breaks to the surface again, holding in his hand the dripping, precious thing that he went down to recover. Let us dive together over the next couple of weeks into the questions of gender and sexuality so that we can find our precious people where they are and bring them into the light of God's truth. Thank you.